we're going to move on to our first keynote. One of someone I'm very grateful to have been introduced to in the last year or so, who I don't quite know how to describe other than what I would consider, one of today's leading philosophers and thinkers, and a man who has dedicated his life to thinking very deeply about many of the most important issues of our time. And it's an honor to have him here and be our first speaker, and set the tone for the event, and be joining us on Sunday as well as he shares more of his thoughts. But with that, I want to give a warm, appreciative welcome to Forrest Landry.
Good morning. So thank you for inviting me into this space. For those of you who don't know me yet, my work is, I would characterize it as being essentially in the space of metaphysics. This isn't sort of a new age thing. It's essentially the basis upon which a philosophy would rest. Essentially, it explores three basic questions. What is, what is called the question of ontology is just basically saying what is, what is the ground of being itself. The next question would be, how do we know? And the third question would be essentially, what do we value? So ontology, epistemology, and axiology. And so when we're thinking about things like civilization design, or how to mitigate existential risk, or where do we want to be 1,000 years from now in terms of health of the planet and quality of life, and the kinds of issues that matter to us as a species and as an ecology, life on Earth, basically. So it's essentially part of the reason that I would say these are questions that are relevant is that, I'm sure many people are aware there's a lot of things happening right now in the space of technology, in the space of how national governments relate to one another, how humanity is in relationship to nature, and issues associated with that. So as a philosopher, as a metaphysicist, I bring tools in the space of how to think about these kinds of questions and what sort of techniques we might have to understand topics like ethics ethics in this case being how do we make good choices? On what basis of principle do we identify what our values are and how to bring our values forward? So Grace spoke earlier about the need for inclusion of basically both sides of the species, and also we could speak to the need of inclusion for nature and the need for inclusion of other cultures and things of that nature. But in the sense of basically answering something of the nature of how would we do civilization design? What would be the values that we would bring forward as a way of understanding what does it mean when we say healthy community or healthy planet? What does it mean when we say that the relationship that we have with nature or with technology, or the relationship between technology and nature, is itself furthering of life, furthering of the goodness that we would want to have in our future? So in this sense, I'm going to switch from basically saying, okay, here's a little bit of how I think about things, or the kind of orientation I'm coming from, to how might we begin to actually answer some of these questions. So the first thing that I would sort of point to in the nature of what is, right? What is the ground from which some of this stuff might be considered? And then again, there's three basic concepts. We know that change is happening. We have learned via technology how to learn and do things, right? So technology is essentially a force of causation. And that when we're thinking about our choices, when we're thinking about our capacity to make good choices, we are thinking about choice. And so I would say, as kind of a first observation, that the notion of the real is that which is partaking of, or is composed of, choice, change, and causation. So in this sense, we're wanting to sort of notice something about these concepts. We're kind of wanting to notice how these concepts play out in our current scenario. So for example, if we look at history, if we look at sort of the long arc of where we are currently, like what has happened prior to give us perspective on what is happening today. The first thing that we might notice, or if we were to, again, use this perspective of choice, change, and causation as essentially a lens through which to view this, then we would say something like, well, let's see, going back to before recorded history, that the way of people in the world was essentially in direct relationship to change, in direct relationship to nature. Nature is abundantly changing all the time, weather and season and the daily cycle and so on. And so in effect, the quality of life was defined by a person's capacity or a community's capacity to live in right relationship to change. And you see this reflected in the earliest religions. They're very animalistic, or you might have things that describe flow. So for instance, the Eastern religions are very much oriented around the concept of flow and living in right balance. So then, we can sort of say that the quality of mastery, or the quality of right relationship, was very much characterized by this notion of change. And basically, that was the orientation that was held as the highest philosophies at the time. And then gradually, starting with agriculture, perhaps, and moving forward to what has become essentially the Western Enlightenment, perhaps, if people are willing to tolerate that language. But the notion is that at some point we became more and more effective at using tools. And so there was a sense of understanding how the tool itself is a tool. What does that actually mean? And so in effect, with the development of this sort of perspective that we have come to call the scientific methods, and again, the sort of epistemic technique associated with that, i.e. how do we know something, that we learned a way of working with nature or working with the world that effectively had this quality of conditionalization, that we could change the environment around us using the tools and techniques, using the learnings of science, and then translating those into technology to build things like refrigerators or houses. And so in this sense, part of the thing that has made the modern world the way it is essentially an integration and adaptation of this concept of causation fully throughout the matrix of everybody's lives. So in this particular sense, there's been this gradual but overwhelming transition from awareness of how to live in flow, how to live in the context of change, to how to essentially work with causation in a way that essentially transcends change. And so in this sense, we can say, okay, well, here we are, we have basically done as much as we can with causation. We have, through the scientific method and through technology, really become quite adept at working with causation. And with that, of course, comes its own challenges. We now are noticing issues at a global scale, issues of pollution, inequality, things that have to do with dynamics of global warming or deforestation or species loss. And in this particular sense, we're noticing that causation as a tool isn't necessarily helpful to addressing all of these issues. One of the things I'll be speaking on a little bit later on Sunday is this, the relationship between technology and life in terms of things like artificial intelligence and what kinds of issues that creates. But more to the point in this moment is to basically say that technology can't be considered the solution to all problems. Technology tells you what you can do, but it doesn't tell you what you should do. And so in this particular sense, there's a very fundamental need for us to become skillful at knowing what are we going to do? What should we do? What is the right thing to do? And so a conference like this one is essentially an exploration of that question. How do we know what is the right thing to do? On what basis do we select our values? On what basis do we make choices? And it's not just that we're making choices individually, but that we're needing to learn how to make choices collectively. And part of the reason that this becomes particularly relevant in our current times is that some of you may be aware of this thing called the Fermi paradox. It's basically saying something along the lines of, the universe is vast. There are 700 billion stars. And that if there were technological civilizations out there, if our progression as life is to move from change into this sort of causal process and to become a technological culture, we should be observing signs and observable communication with these other cultures. Like, where are all the aliens, so to speak? But when we look out into the universe with, our telescopes and radio telescopes and things like that, we don't necessarily see any sign at all of other life in the universe. So the question becomes, where are they? Like, is life incredibly rare? Or is it the case that technological civilization just doesn't endure? And in this particular situation, I'm not necessarily concerned with answering that specific question right now. But what I can do is I can say that regardless of which it is, we are at a key moment in time in our species evolution, that if we are to genuinely address the question, we need to essentially first recognize that life in the universe is probably pretty rare, and it's certainly worth protecting. And that secondly, if it is the case that technological civilizations don't live very long, then we need to become really, really skillful so that we either do continue as a species, or we essentially learn a better way of being that isn't necessarily limited by technology. And so in this sense, I'm thinking about choices as being crucial, right? Choices is essentially opening the door to the future. And the thing that's interesting about this is that no amount of understanding of causation is ever going to be the equivalent of understanding even the least choice. Choice is transcendent beyond causation, the same way that causation is transcendent beyond change. And that if we're going to be skillful as a species, it's going to be skillful at making choices. So in this sense, philosophy has just gone from being kind of this, sort of background topic, which we use as a way of thinking about, what might be important to think about and how do we do things, to essentially addressing as a kind of clarity, what are the central issues of this time? If we look at kind of the modern philosophical movements and things like that, you'll notice, we mentioned the woke movement, for example. And if you look at it just as sort of like even slight little way of saying, well, what is this movement about? We hear issues mentioning like consent and what is ways of addressing inequality or addressing colonialism. And so in effect, there's this sort of critique of causal process and all of the things that go with it, with the notion of that we need to be much more conscious, much more aware of how to make choices, both individually and collectively. And then in effect, what we're looking at is essentially designs of systems like governance and design of systems like community, and learning how to distinguish between community process and institutional process. In effect, we have, as a world and as a species, we have become so enamored with causation that we have effectively replaced community process with a commercial one. And there are obviously issues with that. So in effect, there's a need for us to learn how to do community again and learn how to make choices as a community, not just as a community of people here in this forum, but essentially as a community of people in the world. Right? The notion of institution as basically being the only way in which groups of people can make choices is something that I would say is an assumption of, to be studied with some agnosticism. There are multiple ways in which we can have community process be essentially one that is wise enough to make the kinds of choices that are needed for our species now, particularly in the face of things like civilization design and existential risk and what I would call long-term conscious sustainable evolution. So in that sense, there's a sort of connection between the notion of values, the notion of ethics, and the notion of choice. In effect, we're saying that ethics is the principles of effective choice, choice being effective to the degree that it enhances life, that it creates community, that it develops the sorts of nurturing relationships that are essentially furthering of our future. So in this sense, when I'm looking at an event like this one, and I'm noticing that there are a lot of people who are thinking, about pretty important things in pretty profound ways. And it comes to, my perspective of how do we integrate some of these things? What ways in which can these projects work together? Or what are the sorts of things that we would really love to leave behind as a legacy? Like, we're all people. We all have lifetimes that are finite, that we're mortal beings basically. And so in effect, we're in the space of what are the choices that we make individually and collectively that provide for a future for our children, for our next generations. And so it's with those sorts of keys in mind that I basically say, well, this lens of deep past being essentially understood in terms of change, recent past in the sense of the last few hundred years being understood in terms of causation, and that our moment today and the future is defined by the choices we make. In effect, the nature of self is who am I in this moment is essentially the product of all the choices that I have made and all the choices that I could make. So in this sense, the skillfulness with which we make choices, both at the level of ourselves individually in our moment in this time, and collectively as a group of people, and collectively as essentially whatever communities that you're part of currently, or maybe politically even, that there's a sense in which we become more skillful at making choices because we need to. And that if we're in effect going to evolve as a species, it's going to be just as much because we have developed a mastery of the process of making quality choices as it will be because we have developed a mastery of causation, or at prior epochs of time, a mastery of living in flow. And that in effect, it's kind of a closure of the cycle, that by being effective in the sense of loving and in the sense of producing community, in the sense of producing holistic health, in the sense of thinking about things in a holistic way, that we can actually support the value of life itself. We can support the value of the ways in which we are all glad to be alive. And so in effect, there's a sense in which we are, through that process of making effective choices, setting the ground for us to be back in right relationship with flow, both with nature and now with technology. In a sense, we could think of these as three great creative forces. We know that evolution can create, otherwise we would not be here having this conversation. And we also know that our choices can create. Right? We bring things into being with our voices and with our words and with our actions. And so in effect, we have, as a side effect of that, or as a result of that, developed technology, which at this particular point is creating all sorts of things for us as well. So in effect, you could think of technology as a creative force that happens at a large scale in sort of this causal, macroscopic sort of way, and evolution as essentially a microscopic force of change, that it emerges from the substrate in all places at once. And that our choices as individuals is sort of in the middle scales, it's in the mesoscopic range. And so in effect, if we're wanting to come into skillfulness of choicefulness, not just as ourselves, but also as evolution, in concert with evolution and in concert with technology, that we have to consider the relationship between technology and evolution itself, and what choices we're looking at in that particular space. Currently, it's the situation that technology is mostly dominating of evolution. It's mostly dominating of nature. And we think as a species currently, we have this sort of naivete that nature is a source of resources, which we then transform into technology, which then allows us to extract more resources from nature. And we think that technology is in service to humanity. We think that nature is in service to humanity. But actually, it would make much more sense for us to have technology be in service to nature, technology be in service to the well-being of not just the natural world, but our capacity to make choice. That's not currently how it's used. It's mostly used in a way that is in support of institutional design. But if we're wanting to essentially move into a world where we have freedom of choice and we have the capacity to make good choices, then to some extent, we're going to need to reconcile these dynamics in a fundamental way. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. We're very shy on time for questions. If you have any guidance on how we reconcile those choices that I'm sure it can't be answered so quickly. And for everyone listening, Forrest will be speaking again on Sunday on both existential risk and civilization design with our friend Benjamin Life. So please come back for that. So Thank you so much, Forrest. Really grateful to have you here and to kick things off with such depth.